$3. That's all Silas Ward had left in his pocket when he heard the auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. But what he was about to buy with those 3 crumpled bills would change everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. The dusty main street of Copper Falls was buzzing with the usual Saturday crowd. Ranchers, miners, and drifters all gathered around makeshift stalls selling everything from cattle to mining equipment. Silas had come to town for supplies, nothing more. He needed rope, maybe some coffee if he had enough left over. His weathered hands gripped the reins of his horse as he surveyed the chaos of the weekly market. That's when he saw the crowd gathering near the old grain warehouse. Men were pushing forward, voices getting louder, excited. Silas had seen enough auctions to know the sound of bidding, but something felt different about this one. The voices carried an edge, a hunger that made his stomach turn. He dismounted and walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Through the gaps between shoulders and hats, he caught sight of what they were bidding on. A young Chinese girl, barely more than a child, stood on a wooden crate like livestock. Her black hair hung in matted strands around her face, and her clothes were little more than rags. But it was her eyes that stopped Silas cold. They held a terror so deep it seemed to echo in his chest. The auctioneer, a greasy man in a stained vest, was calling out numbers. $2, $250. The bids weren't looking at her face. They were looking at her like she was a tool, something to be used and discarded. Silas felt his jaw clench as he recognized some of the men in the crowd. Ranch owners who worked their hands to death. Mine foremen known for their cruelty. A man in a black coat raised his hand. $3. The auctioneer's gavel was already rising when Silas heard his own voice cut through the noise. $3.50. The words had left his mouth before his brain could stop them. Every head in the crowd turned to stare at him. The girl's eyes found his, and for a moment, the world went silent. The auctioneer looked confused. This wasn't how these things usually went. Silas wasn't known for bidding on anything, let alone this. But the man's greed won out over his confusion. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to split the morning in half. But Silas quickly realized he'd made a terrible mistake. He only had $3 in his pocket, not the $350. And now every eye in that crowd was on him, waiting to see what the quiet rancher planned to do with his purchase. The girl was still staring at him, and he could see a new kind of fear creeping into her expression. Fear of him. The crowd was getting restless. Silas could feel their eyes boring into him as he stood there, frozen by the weight of what he'd just done. The auctioneer cleared his throat impatiently, his hand extended for payment. $3.50, money Silas didn't have. His mind raced as he reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the 3 crumpled bills. He could feel sweat beating on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. Behind him, someone chuckled darkly. Word was already spreading through the crowd that the old hermit had bitten off more than he could chew. That's when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Marshall Tucker stood beside him, a man Silas had known since they were boys. Tucker's weathered face showed no emotion as he leaned in close. "You short, Silas," he whispered. Before Silas could answer, Tucker pressed 2 quarters into his palm. "Pay the man." Silas handed over the money, his hands steadier than he felt inside. The auctioneer snatched the bills and coins, counted them twice, then jerked his head toward the girl. "She's yours. Got papers if you want them." He held out a crude bill of sale, ink still wet. Papers like she was a horse or a piece of farm equipment. Silas stared at the document, then looked back at the girl. She was trembling now, her small hands clasped in front of her, like she was trying to make herself invisible. The crowd was already losing interest. Moving on to the next auction, cattle this time. Something normal. Silas folded the paper and stuffed it in his jacket pocket without looking at it. He approached the girl slowly, the way he might approach a spooked horse. When he got close enough, he could see the bruises on her arms. The way she flinched when his shadow fell across her. Someone had hurt her. Multiple someones from the look of it. He stopped a few feet away and held out his hand, not demanding, just offering. "My name's Silas," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at his outstretched hand like it might be a trap. When she finally spoke, Her voice was barely a whisper. Min. The words were so soft he almost missed them. Her English was broken but clear enough. My name. Silas nodded and lowered his hand. Mlin. That's a good name. He looked around at the dispersing crowd, then back at her. Are you hungry? The question seemed to surprise her. She nodded once quickly, like she was afraid he might change his mind about asking. Silas gestured toward his horse. There's a place across the street. We'll get you some food. But as they walked toward the restaurant, Silas noticed the stares following them. The whispers. A Chinese girl walking beside a white rancher meant only one thing to most folks in Copper Falls. And when they reached the restaurant door, the owner stepped out to block their path. We don't serve her kind in here, the man said, his arms crossed. You'll have to find somewhere else. His eyes flicked to Min with unconcealed disgust. Maybe the back alley behind Chen's laundry. That's where they belong. Silas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd been naive to think this would be simple. In a town like Copper Falls, there was no such thing as simple when it came to a Chinese girl and a white man. But he'd already come this far, and turning back now wasn't an option. Not when he could see the resignation creeping back into Min's eyes. The restaurant owner's words hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Silas stared at the man for a long moment. Feeling the familiar anger that had gotten him into trouble before, he could walk away. Take Min somewhere else. Keep the peace like he always did. Instead, he stepped closer to the restaurant owner. Her money's as good as anyone's, Silas said, his voice low and steady. And since I'm paying, I reckon that makes it my money. The owner, a thick-set man named Garrett, didn't budge. Don't matter whose money it is. I don't serve Chinamen in my place. Bad for business. He glanced around at the growing crowd of onlookers. You understand, Silas? Nothing personal, but it felt personal. Standing there with men behind him, Silas could feel her shrinking back, trying to disappear again. The same look he'd seen on her face at the auction, like she expected the world to treat her as less than human. Then I guess we'll eat somewhere else, Silas said. He turned to leave, but Garrett's next words stopped him cold. Might want to be careful, Ward. People are already talking about what you bought at that auction. Questions about what you plan to do with her. Garrett's smile was ugly. Wouldn't want folks getting the wrong idea about your intentions. The threat was clear. In a town like Copper Falls, reputation was everything, and a man's reputation could be destroyed by whispers and assumptions, especially when it came to a Chinese girl. Silas felt his fists clench at his sides. Marshal Tucker appeared beside them, seemingly from nowhere. Problem here, gentlemen. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but his eyes were sharp. Because if there is, maybe we should discuss it at my office. Garrett's bluster deflated slightly. No problem, Marshal. Just explaining house rules to Mr. Ward here. Tucker nodded slowly. House rules? I see. He looked at Silas, then at Emlyn, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. Well, as it happens, I know a place that serves excellent food to anyone with coin to pay for it. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. She's got a dining room that's open to the public. It wasn't really a suggestion. Tucker's tone made that clear. Silas nodded and gestured for Min to follow him. As they walked away, he could hear Garrett muttering under his breath, but the man was smart enough not to say anything loud enough for the marshal to hear. The boarding house was only 2 blocks away, but it felt like the longest walk of Silas's life. Every person they passed stared, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. Word was spreading fast about what had happened at the auction. When they reached Mrs. Henderson's, the elderly woman took one look at Mlin, and her expression softened. Poor child looks half-starved, she said to Silas. I'll fix her up something proper. But as they sat down at a small table in the corner, Silas noticed the other patrons whispering and pointing. And through the window he could see men gathering in small groups on the street outside, the kind of groups that meant trouble was coming. Mrs. Henderson set down a plate of beef stew and fresh bread in front of Emlyn, who stared at it like she couldn't believe it was real. Her hands shook as she picked up the spoon, and Silas realized she was trying not to cry. When was the last time someone had given her a real meal? She ate slowly at first, then faster, like she was afraid someone might take it away. Silas watched her, feeling something twist in his chest. How long had she been hungry? How long had she been treated like something less than human? The dining room had grown quieter since they'd arrived. Other patrons finished their meals quickly and left, shooting glances their way. Mrs. Henderson bustled around, but even she seemed nervous. Through the window, Silas could see the crowd outside had grown larger. Silas. Min's voice was so quiet he almost missed it. She was looking at him with those dark eyes, and he could see she was trying to say something important. Why you help me? It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd opened his mouth at that auction. Why had he done it? He'd come to town for rope and coffee, and instead he'd bought a Chinese girl with money he didn't have. It didn't make sense even to him. Don't know, he said honestly. Just seemed like the right thing to do. She studied his face like she was trying to read something written there. Other men, they want different things. Her voice dropped even lower. Bad things. Silas felt that cold anger settling in his chest again. Of course they did. To most of the men at that auction. She wasn't a person with a name and feelings and fears. She was just something to be used. I'm not like other men, he said. Before Lynn could respond, the front door of the boarding house burst open. 3 men walked in, and Silas recognized them immediately. Cord Jennings, who owned the biggest ranch in the territory, his son Blake, mean as a snake and twice as dangerous, and Frank Morrison, who ran the mining operation east of town. They weren't here for dinner. Cord scanned the room until his eyes found Silas and Lynn. His face was red with anger as he stalked over to their table. Ward, what the hell do you think you're doing? Silas sat down his coffee cup carefully. Eating dinner. You got a problem with that? My problem, Cord said, his voice rising, is that you just made every decent family in this town look like fools, bidding on a Chinese like she's worth something. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Mrs. Henderson gasped from behind the counter. Min's face went pale, but she didn't look away. Silas stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Watch your mouth, Jennings. Blake stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. Or what, old man? You going to fight all of us over some yellow skin? If you were Silas, what would you do? Back down to protect Min from more trouble, or stand your ground and risk everything getting worse? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Silas decided next would determine whether either of them made it out of Copper Falls alive. I reckon, Silas said quietly, a man's worth isn't determined by the color of his skin. Same goes for a woman. Frank Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. You gone soft in the head, Ward. Or maybe you just been alone on that ranch too long. His eyes flicked to Lynn with disgust. Either way, this ends now. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Blake's hand hovered over his gun, and Silas could see the eager gleam in the young man's eyes. Blake had always been looking for an excuse to prove himself, and here was Silas, alone and outnumbered. But before anyone could draw iron, Marshall Tucker stepped through the doorway. His boots rang against the wooden floor as he surveyed the scene. Gentlemen, he said calmly, I hope we're not about to have trouble in Mrs. Henderson's establishment. Cord turned to face the marshal, his face still flushed with anger. Tucker, you need to put a stop to this. Ward's brought shame on this whole town with his purchase. Tucker's eyes flicked to Min, who was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Then he looked back at Cord. Last I checked, what a man does with his own money is his own business. Assuming it's legal, of course. Legal? Blake spat. What's legal about buying a Chinese girl like she's cattle? Well now, Tucker said slowly, that's an interesting question. See, I've been doing some thinking about that auction, and I can't help but wonder where exactly did those folks who were selling her get the legal right to do so? The room went silent. Silas watched as the implications of Tucker's words sank in. If the people running the auction didn't have legal ownership of Lynn, then the whole thing was illegal, which meant everyone who'd bid on her was potentially part of a crime. Frank Morrison cleared his throat nervously. Now hold on, Marshal. We were just trying to... That is, we thought. You thought you could buy a human being like she was a piece of livestock? Tucker finished. And now you're upset because Silas here outbid you. He stepped closer to the 3 men. Makes a man wonder what your intentions were. Cord's face was turning purple. You can't seriously be taking his side in this. I'm not taking anyone's side, Tucker said. I'm just pointing out that if there's any crime been committed here today, it wasn't by Silas Ward. His hand rested on his gun belt. Now I suggest you gentlemen move along before I start asking more questions about that auction. Blake looked like he wanted to argue, but his father grabbed his arm. Come on, Cord muttered. This isn't over, Ward. After they left, the dining room felt like it could breathe again. Mrs. Henderson let out a shaky sigh and began clearing tables with nervous energy. Tucker pulled up a chair and sat down across from Silas and Emlyn. They're not wrong about one thing, he said quietly. This isn't over. Word's spreading fast, and not everyone's going to see things the way I do. He looked at me with kind eyes. You got somewhere safe to take her? Silas nodded. My ranch. It's about 10 while me are out. Good. I'd get her there before dark. Tucker leaned forward. But Silas, you need to understand something. What you did today, it's going to make enemies. People who want to hurt both of you just to prove a point. Through the window, Silas could see more men gathering in the street. Their voices were getting louder, and some were pointing at the boarding house. The mob was growing and their intentions were becoming clearer by the minute. The crowd outside was getting uglier by the minute. Silas could hear voices through the window, angry words that made his blood run cold. Someone shouted about teaching lessons and putting people in their place. Another voice called for running the Chinese girl out of town on a rail. Tucker stood and walked to the window, his face grim. There's about 20 men out there now. Some I recognize, some I don't. He turned back to Silas. You got another way out of here? Mrs. Henderson looked up from where she was frantically wiping down tables. There's a back door through the kitchen, leads to the alley behind the mercantile. Silas helped Emlyn to her feet. She'd barely touched her food after the confrontation started, and he could see the fear creeping back into her eyes. We need to get to my horse, he said to Tucker. Your horse is tied up right in front of that crowd, Tucker pointed out. Soon as you step outside, they'll see you. That's when Mrs. Henderson spoke up. My husband's got an old wagon behind the boarding house. Horse, too. Not much to look at, but it'll get you where you need to go. She was wringing her hands in her apron. I can't stand seeing that poor child frightened like this. Silas felt a wave of gratitude toward the old woman. I'll make sure it gets back to you. Don't worry about that now, she said, already heading toward the kitchen. Just get her somewhere safe. They moved quickly through the kitchen and out the back door. The alley was empty, but Silas could hear the crowd's voices echoing between the buildings. Mrs. Henderson led them to a small stable where an old mare stood hitched to a weather-beaten wagon. As Silas helped Emlyn into the wagon bed, she grabbed his arm. What if they follow? She whispered. What if they come to your home? It was a question he'd been trying not to think about. His ranch was isolated, but that could work both ways. If trouble came calling, there'd be no one around to help. Just him and whatever guns he could muster. We'll face that when it comes, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Tucker appeared at the mouth of the alley, his face tense. They're starting to spread out, looking for other ways into the boarding house. You need to go now. Silas climbed into the driver's seat and took up the res. The old mare wasn't much to look at, but her eyes were alert and her stance was strong. She'd do. As they pulled out of the alley and onto a side street, Silas could see the main crowd still gathered in front of the boarding house. But smaller groups were breaking off, and he spotted Blake Jennings leading one of them toward the back streets. They'd made it 3 blocks when Silas heard the sound he'd been dreading. Hoof-beat-tats coming fast. He glanced back and saw 5 riders emerging from between the buildings behind them. Blake was in the lead, and his face was twisted with anger. There they are! Blake's voice carried across the dusty street. Don't let them get away. Silas snapped the reins, urging the old mare into a faster pace. But the wagon was heavy and the horse was old. The riders were gaining ground quickly. Min pressed herself against the wagon bed, her knuckles white as she gripped the sides. The edge of town was still half a mile away. At this pace, they'd never make it before the riders caught up. Silas's mind raced, trying to think of options. He could try to outrun them, but that seemed hopeless. He could stop and try to reason with them, but Blake looked far beyond reasoning. That's when he heard the gunshot. The bullet went past his ear and splintered the wooden seat beside him. These men weren't interested in talking. They wanted blood. The second gunshot was closer, too close. Silas felt the old mare stumble as the bullet grazed her flank, but the tough horse kept running. Behind them, Blake and his men were whooping like they were on a hunting party, their horses closing the distance with every stride. Silas pulled his own gun from its holster and twisted in the seat. He fired once, not aiming to kill, but to slow them down. The shot went wide, but it made the riders spread out, giving him a few precious seconds. "Hold on!" he shouted to Min, then yanked the reins hard to the left. The wagon lurched off the main road and onto a narrow trail that led toward the rocky hills outside town. It was rougher ground, harder on the wagon, but it might give them an advantage. The old mare was breathing hard, foam flecking her mouth, but she kept going. These ranch horses were bred for endurance, and she had more fight in her than her appearance suggested. The wagon bounced and rattled over the uneven ground, and Silas heard Mleen cry out as she was thrown against the side. Behind them, the riders were having trouble with the terrain. Their horses, bred for speed on flat ground, were struggling with the rocks and loose soil. Blake's mount stumbled, nearly throwing him, and one of the other riders had to pull up when his horse stepped wrong. But they were still coming. Silas spotted an outcropping of rocks ahead, a place where the trail narrowed between two large boulders. If he could get the wagon through there, the riders would have to come single file. It might be their only chance. The wagon scraped between the rocks with inches to spare. As soon as they were through, Silas pulled the mare to a stop and jumped down, his rifle in his hands. "Stay down," he called to Min. Blake appeared at the mouth of the narrow passage, his face flushed with rage and exertion. "You can't run forever, Ward. Send out the girl and we might let you ride away." "Go to hell," Silas called back, raising his rifle. Blake's response was another gunshot. The bullet struck the rock near Silas's head, sending chips of stone flying. Silas fired back, and this time his aim was true. Blake's horse reared, throwing the younger man to the ground. The other riders pulled back, suddenly realizing this wasn't going to be as easy as they'd thought. But Silas knew they wouldn't give up. They'd find another way around or wait for reinforcements. That's when he heard something that made his blood run cold. More hoof beat-tats coming from ahead of them. Blake's men hadn't been the only ones to leave town. Someone else had taken a different route, cutting off their escape. They were trapped between two groups of riders with nowhere to run. The rocky outcropping that had protected them was about to become their prison. And as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Silas realized this might be where both their stories ended. He looked at Mlin huddled in the wagon bed and made a decision that would change everything. Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded paper the auctioneer had given him the bill of sale. With hands that weren't quite steady, he tore it into pieces and let the wind scatter them across the rocky ground. "What you do?" May Leon whispered, watching the paper fragments blow away. "Setting you free," Silas said simply. "Really free? No papers, no ownership. You're your own person now." But freedom wouldn't mean much if they didn't survive the next few minutes. The riders from ahead were getting closer, and Blake was back on his feet, gathering his men for another assault. That's when Marshal Tucker's voice rang out across the rocks. "That's far enough, boys." Silas looked up to see Tucker and 3 deputies riding hard from the direction of town. The marshal had his gun drawn and his face was set in hard lines. The riders who'd been approaching from ahead suddenly found themselves caught between Tucker's guns and the rocky outcropping. "Marshal," Blake called out, trying to sound reasonable. "We're just trying to stop a crime here. Ward stole that girl fair and square." "Funny thing about that auction," Tucker called back, his voice carrying easily across the rocky ground. "Turns out those folks who were selling her didn't have any legal right to do so, which means every man who bid on her was participating in human trafficking." He spurred his horse closer. "That's a federal crime. Blake means federal prison." The blood drained from Blake's face around him. His companions were looking at each other nervously. What had seemed like righteous anger a few minutes ago was suddenly looking like a very serious mistake. "Now," Tucker continued, "I suggest you boys ride back to town and forget this whole thing ever happened before I decide to start asking questions about who knew what and when." One by one, Blake's men began backing away. They'd signed up for intimidating a Chinese girl and an old rancher, not for facing federal charges. Within minutes, only Blake himself remained, his face twisted with frustrated rage. "This isn't over, Ward," he spat. "Yes, it is," Tucker said firmly. It's over because I'm making it over. Anyone who bothers these folks from now on answers to me personally." Blake glared at them all for a long moment, then wheeled his horse around and rode away. The sound of hoofbeat tats faded into the distance, leaving only the wind whistling through the rocks. Tucker dismounted and walked over to where Silas was helping Emlyn down from the wagon. "You two all right?" Silas nodded, though his hands were still shaking slightly. "Thanks, Marshal. Don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." "Well," Tucker said with a slight smile, "Mrs. Henderson sent word about which way you'd gone. Figured you might need some help." He looked at Emlyn with kind eyes. "Miss, you're safe now and you're free. No one owns you and no one has the right to hurt you." Min looked up at Silas, then at Tucker, then back at Silas for the first time since he'd seen her at the auction. She smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. "What happens now?" she asked. Silas looked out across the vast landscape toward his ranch. It was a big place, too big for one man. There was plenty of room for someone who needed a new start, a safe place to figure out what came next. Now, he said, "We go home." 6 months later, Min was running the most successful vegetable garden in 3 counties, selling her produce to the same stores that had once refused to serve her. Silas had deeded half his ranch to her, making her the first Chinese woman to own land in the territory, and on quiet evenings, sitting on the porch watching the sunset. They would sometimes talk about that day in Copper Falls when $3 changed 2 lives forever. The bill of sale was gone, scattered to the wind. But the friendship that grew from that moment of courage lasted for the rest of their lives. Now click on the video on the screen because the next story carries something you can't explain, only feel. And when it ends, you won't be the same. Click on the video now.